So I've been asked several questions about the bipartisan, bicameral COVID emergency relief bill. And one of the questions that I hear are, what are some of the notable wins for Alaska in this two-bill proposal? The bill really does include a number of provisions that could be of benefit to our state, including what has been identified as a key priority by so many, and that is extension of time to use the CARES Act funding. This is going to be critical for our tribes. This is going to be critical for our communities. Very, very important. On the transportation side, there's $8 billion to support payroll of parts of the transportation industry that did not get relief in the CARES Act. So this would include ferries, like the Alaska Marine Highway Transportation System, and buses. Airport grant funding to help large and small airports in the state's essential air service funding, as well as extension of the Airline Payroll Support Program, the PSP. That's extended through March 31st. On the state, local, and tribal side, this is the piece that has generated a great deal of opposition from some, and so where this is going to end up in the final proposal remains to be seen. But what we had included was $160 billion in total funding for state, local, and tribal governments, including an $8 billion set aside for tribal entities, including tribal governments, tribal organizations, and Alaska Native corporations, to ensure that all Alaska natives are covered with their COVID expenses, regardless of who would provide them. On the healthcare side, we include provisions from the bill that I introduced with Senator King called the TRACE Act, which would help enhance coronavirus testing, contact tracing, and supported isolation efforts. With regards to vaccine distribution and funding, a very, very key part of this bill is additional funding, $6 billion for vaccine distribution. It's going to be very important to us in a state like Alaska that is logistically challenged. On the ag and nutrition side, there is $500 million to build out water infrastructure in rural Alaska villages. This is through the USDA program. It includes not only Alaska villages, but within the territories and the Indian reservations. We temporarily increased the value of SNAP benefits, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, to address the higher cost of food and to allow seniors and other vulnerable Americans to reduce the number of times that they have to visit the grocery store. We recognize that with COVID comes many, many more stressors, and that leads to additional focus on mental health and addiction issues. So there is $185 million that is set aside for tribes, tribal organizations, and urban Indian organizations for substance use disorder and behavioral health efforts. I think it is important that the amount for mental health and substance abuse is substantially higher than we saw in the CARES Act. We also address the increase in opioid and other drug-related overdose deaths during COVID-19 through provisions that we secured from the bill that I have introduced called the Mainstreaming Addiction Treatment, the MAT Act. On the education side, the bill includes language from my legislation, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. I introduced this with Senator Smith, but we temporarily waived the ESEA provision that would prohibit 21st century after-school providers from providing services during the school day for students who are not receiving full-time in-person instruction. We want to make sure that services during the school day that are provided allow also for flexibility for E-rate, so that schools in remote villages will have the flexibility to deliver services to the homes of students, which is so important in rural areas. On the broadband side, $100 million for the state to fund new broadband infrastructure. There's at least $50,000 to each tribe to support broadband. And I think it's important that this is just scratching the surface. The emergency relief is the product of bipartisan, bicameral compromise, but it was an effort where I made sure to make sure that the needs of Alaskans were well represented. We have strong support for our fisheries with over $500 million directed towards fishery relief, and I think we know in our state that that is significant and an area that, again, with CARES, we knew we needed to be doing more there.